There are few things in this world more quietly infuriating than a letter that costs you money you didn't agree to spend. It arrives unassumingly, nestled between a credit card offer and a coupon for a local pizzeria, but it carries the weight of a royal decree. The letter that landed in my mailbox on a crisp Tuesday morning was precisely that kind of paper and ink tyrant. It was from my homeowners association, and it cheerfully informed me that my quarterly dues were being increased by 40%, effective immediately. There was a vague, almost poetic mention of necessary community beautification projects and enhanced neighborhood services, but a distinct lack of specifics. It was a fiscal punch in the gut, delivered with a smug, corporate smile. My name is Arthur Pendleton. For 40 years, my world was institutional finance. I was a ghost in the machine, a man who specialized in valuing, structuring, and executing corporate acquisitions. My talent was seeing the architecture of power behind the balance sheet, identifying the weaknesses, the dependencies, the load-bearing walls of an enterprise. It was a lucrative, if not exactly thrilling career. When I retired, I cashed out and bought a peaceful home in the manicured, tree-lined enclave of Willow Creek, seeking nothing more than tranquility, a well-tended garden, and freedom from the predatory chess of the financial world. I thought I'd left all that behind. But in my quest for peace, I had overlooked the most common and petty of dictatorships, the HOA, led by its president, one Mr. Gerald Abernathy. Abernathy was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, constantly adjusting it, making sure everyone saw it. He was a retired mid-level manager of something unimportant, and he wielded his power over lawn height and trash can placement with the zeal of a conquering general. He and his board were a cabal of bored busybodies who had mistaken a volunteer position for a throne. What Abernathy and his cronies didn't know, as they plotted to fund a new gazebo that no one had asked for, was that they had just prodded a very particular, very methodical bear out of hibernation. They thought they were levying a fee on a quiet retiree. They were about to find themselves in a boardroom they didn't know existed, facing a banker they had fatally underestimated. Have you ever felt so utterly powerless against a petty bureaucracy that you found yourself fantasizing about not just fighting it, but dismantling it brick by bureaucratic brick? I'm sure many of you have. Let me know in the comments, because this is the story of how I stopped fantasizing and started planning. This isn't just a tale of fighting City Hall. It's the story of how I quietly bought it. The letter was a declaration of war, and their chosen battlefield was a hastily called informational meeting in the community clubhouse. The air was thick with the discontent of my neighbors, a chorus of grumbles and frustrated sighs. I watched Abernathy at the podium, basking in the attention. He began with condescending platitudes about shared responsibility and protecting property values, the classic rhetoric of a despot dressing up a shakedown as a noble cause. When he opened the floor for questions, I stood up, my years of presenting to skeptical boards kicking in. I kept my tone level, my questions simple and direct. Mr. Abernathy, I began, could the board please provide a detailed breakdown of the projected costs for these beautification projects? And have we solicited at least 3 competitive bids for the work, as stipulated in our own bylaws? Abernathy's smile tightened into a brittle line. Mr. Pendleton, he said, his voice dripping with false patience, the board has conducted its due diligence. We have chosen the vendors we feel will best serve the community's interests. We don't have time to get bogged down in endless procedural debates. He was waving away the rules he was supposed to uphold. I pressed on. A 40% increase is substantial. Surely the residents are entitled to see the math that justifies it before a vote is called. That's when he decided to make it personal. He looked me up and down, a smug little smirk playing on his lips. Well, Arthur, he said, using my first name to feign intimacy while actually asserting dominance, we understand that financial obligations can be a strain. Perhaps this neighborhood is no longer the right economic fit for some of our residents. The implication was clear and ugly. If you can't afford our whims, you should leave. The room went quiet, the insult hanging in the air. It was a classic power play. Shame the questioner, paint them as poor or problematic, and intimidate everyone else into silence. It worked. The fight went on my neighbors. They were cowed. The vote was a formality, a rubber stamp on Abernathy's decree. I sat back down, not in anger, but in cold, clarifying fury. The personal jab hadn't just stung. It had illuminated the path forward. He was right. This wasn't a debate. It was a matter of power. Arguing with him was like reasoning with a tidal wave. You don't persuade it. You get out of its way, or you build a barrier it cannot breach. My quiet suburban life was over. The game was on, but I wouldn't be playing by his rules. The game was rigged, stacked in his favor. So, I decided I would have to buy the entire casino. I retreated to my home office, a room that had been dormant for 2 years, populated only by dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. I powered up my old Bloomberg terminal, the subscription still active out of sheer habit. The familiar green and black glow felt like greeting an old friend. This was my turf. The HOA bylaws and Abernathy's smug pronouncements were his weapons. Financial data, market analysis, and capital, these were mine. My first step was to pull every public document associated with the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Financial statements, past budgets, meeting minutes, county filings. I printed them all, spreading them across my large mahogany desk like a general mapping a campaign. I wasn't just looking for malfeasance, though I was sure I'd find it. I was looking for vulnerability. I was looking for their lifeline. I spent hours tracing the flow of money. Dues came in, expenses went out. But I paid closest attention to the larger transactions, capital improvement loans, lines of credit, and their primary operating accounts. A pattern quickly emerged. Every significant financial instrument, every major cash deposit was held by a single entity, Crestview Community Bank. It wasn't a national behemoth like a Bank of America or a Chase. It was a local, regional player, the kind of institution that prided itself on hometown service. They had maybe a dozen branches across 3 counties. To the HOA, Crestview was their trusted financial partner. To me, it was their single point of failure. My heart began to beat a little faster. This was the aha moment I had been hunting for. The entire operational stability of Abernathy's little kingdom, his ability to fund his pet projects, to pay his brother-in-law's landscaping company, to exert financial pressure on the residents, was completely and utterly dependent on the continued goodwill of this one small bank. I pivoted my research. Crestview Community Bank. It was publicly traded, but on a smaller exchange. The stock was what we used to call thinly traded, meaning there wasn't a huge volume of daily buyers and sellers. I pulled its financials, solid but uninspired. Its stock was, by my estimation, significantly undervalued. The current CEO, a second-generation member of the founding family, was approaching retirement with no clear successor lined up. Other family members held significant blocks of shares, but weren't involved in management. It was a sleeping giant, a stable asset ripe for a strategic investment. Or, in my case, a hostile takeover executed with a smile. Abernathy thought his power came from a clipboard and a gavel. He was wrong. His power came from the loan agreements and credit lines approved by Crestview Bank. And I was about to own it. The beauty of financial warfare is its subtlety. You don't need a frontal assault. You need a brilliant, undeniable strategy executed in plain sight, but understood by almost no one. My plan was not to fight the HOA board. My plan was to become their banker. My allies in this endeavor wouldn't be my grumbling neighbors. They were capital, patience, and the beautiful anonymity of the market. I reactivated a dormant holding company I'd used for years, Pendleton Strategic Ventures, LLC. It was a dry, boring name that would attract no attention. It would be the vessel for my acquisition. The plan was a multi-phased infiltration, designed to be so quiet that by the time anyone noticed, the war would already be over. Phase 1 was accumulation. I started buying shares of Crestview Community Bank on the open market. I kept my purchases small and spread them across multiple brokerage accounts to avoid triggering any single-day volume alerts. The goal was to acquire just under the 5% ownership threshold, the point at which the SEC requires a public disclosure filing. Reaching that limit would be like firing a flare into the night sky, and I preferred to operate in the dark. Phase 2 was targeted acquisition. While my slow and steady open market purchases continued, I began the delicate work of identifying the other major shareholders. I tracked down the disenfranchised members of the founding family, the ones who felt the current CEO was squandering their legacy. I found institutional investors, small pension funds, and endowments, who held shares as a legacy investment and would likely be happy to sell for a modest premium. Meanwhile, Abernathy was reveling in his victory. He began a reign of micro-tyranny. A fresh wave of violation notices went out. Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow, was fined $50 because her garden gnome was deemed a non-conforming lawn ornament. The Henderson family was cited for their basketball hoop being an unaesthetic permanent structure. Abernathy was strutting around the neighborhood with his clipboard, drunk on power, completely oblivious to the tectonic plates of his financial foundation shifting beneath his feet. He was so focused on the color of his neighbor's trim that he failed to notice someone was quietly buying the bank that held his mortgage. His arrogance was the perfect cover for my operations. He believed he had won the only battle that mattered, while I was preparing to seize his entire supply chain. The next 3 months were a masterclass in patient aggression. My days took on a familiar rhythm, a welcome return to the disciplined focus of my former life. My mornings were spent on the phone, my voice a calm, reassuring baritone as I spoke to wealth managers and trust officers. I represent a private equity group, Pendleton Strategic Ventures, I'd explain. We're looking to diversify our portfolio with stable, community-focused assets. We've been very impressed with Crestview's fundamentals, and we're prepared to make a significant, long-term investment. I never lied. I simply control the narrative. I framed my interest as a vote of confidence in the bank's future, not a prelude to a coup. The largest single block of shares I needed belonged to a man named Marcus Thorne, a cousin of the bank's CEO who had been pushed out of the family business years ago. I arranged a meeting at a quiet, wood-paneled steakhouse far from our town. Over a pair of perfectly cooked ribeyes, I didn't just make him an offer. I presented him with a vision. I showed him my analysis, how the bank was underleveraged, how its digital services were a decade behind the times, how its stock could be worth 50% more with the right leadership. Your family built a great institution, Marcus, I said, looking him in the eye. It just needs a little revitalization. I'm offering you a generous price for your shares, a price that reflects their future potential, not their current sleepy state. He saw the logic, but more importantly, he saw a way to vindicate his long-held belief that the bank was being mismanaged. He agreed to sell his entire 18% stake in a private transaction. That was the tipping point. Combined with my open market purchases, I now controlled over 27% of Crestview Community Bank. I continued to accumulate shares through my various brokers, the stock price slowly, almost imperceptibly, creeping upward. To the casual observer, it looked like a healthy, growing company. No one saw the single, controlling hand behind the curtain. All the while, I continued to pay my inflated HOA dues on time, without comment. I even received a violation notice of my own. My newspaper had remained on the driveway past 9 a.m. I paid the $25 fine immediately, including a polite, one-sentence note. Thank you for your diligence. Let Abernathy think he was winning the skirmishes. I was winning the war. With a consolidated ownership stake of just over 40%, it was time to move from the shadows into the boardroom. Through the formal legal channels of Pendleton Strategic Ventures, I submitted a letter to the Crestview Board of Directors. The letter politely noted my holding company's substantial shareholding and, as was my right, formally requested a seat on the board. The effect was immediate and seismic. The bank's CEO, Robert Vance, who had been coasting toward a comfortable retirement, was thrown into a panic. He called an emergency board meeting. A new, dominant shareholder had materialized out of thin air, and they had no idea who I was or what I wanted. They had no choice but to acquiesce. My first board meeting was a carefully staged performance. I arrived not as a conqueror, but as a collaborator. I wore a conservative charcoal suit. I was deferential to Mr. Vance, thanking him for his family's decades of stewardship. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't mention takeovers or sweeping changes. I spoke their language. I talked about shareholder value, risk management, strengthening community ties, and modernizing their loan origination software. I presented a brief but potent analysis of 3 regional competitors who were eating into their market share. I wasn't the threat they feared. I was an asset, a seasoned financial mind ready to help them grow. They were visibly relieved. They saw a partner, not a predator. The name of the Willow Creek, HOA, never crossed my lips. But fate, as it so often does, delivered the next piece of the puzzle directly to my doorstep. As part of my new board duties, I received a weekly packet of documents for review, including all major loan applications. And there it was, nestled on page 47, a multi-million-dollar loan application from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. They wanted to finance a lavish new marble entrance gate and a state-of-the-art security system. Abernathy was doubling down. He had just applied for the rope to hang himself with, and the application was sitting on my desk, waiting for my signature. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The trap was about to be set. The next bank board meeting took place in their mahogany-paneled conference room, a space that smelled of old money and complacency. When the Willow Creek HOA loan came up for discussion, I let the loan officer present his summary first. He recommended approval, citing the HOA's consistent history of paying its bills. Then, all eyes turned to me, the new power player on the board. I picked up the application file, my expression one of clinical concern. "Thank you, Tom." I began, my voice calm and measured. "I've reviewed this application thoroughly, and while I appreciate the HOA's payment history, I have some serious reservations from a risk management perspective. I proceeded to dismantle their application with surgical precision. Their debt-to-income ratio, with this new loan, becomes alarmingly high for a nonprofit entity of this type," I explained, flipping through the pages. "Furthermore, their cash reserves are well below the threshold we typically require for a loan of this magnitude. Most concerningly, their revenue model is based entirely on aggressive and, frankly, unsustainable fee increases levied upon a captive base of residents. This isn't a growth model. It's a stress model." The other board members shifted uncomfortably. I had reframed the discussion from "can they pay" to "is this a responsible loan for us to make?" Killing the loan outright would have been too suspicious. It would have tipped my hand. Instead, I proposed a compromise. "I'm not suggesting we deny the application," I said, adopting a collaborative tone. "I'm suggesting we approve it, but with stricter and more rigorous covenants. Let's require quarterly financial reviews. Let's add a clause that any non-budgeted expenditure over $10,000 requires bank notification. And critically, let's include a material adverse change clause tied to their financial stability. If their projections falter, or if their revenue model shows signs of strain, the bank reserves the right to call the loan immediately." The board nodded in unison. It sounded like simple prudence, like good, responsible banking. They approved my proposal unanimously. A few days later, a letter went out to Mr. Abernathy. It informed him that his loan was approved. He was so giddy at the prospect of his new marble gates that he barely skimmed the attached pages of new terms and conditions. He saw the approval, not the cage being built around him. He signed the paperwork without a second thought, legally binding himself and his HOA to my terms. He had just handed me the keys to his kingdom. A week later, the announcement for the annual HOA meeting arrived in my mailbox. The agenda promised the unveiling of the Grand Entrance Initiative and the ratification of a new budget. I circled the date on my calendar. It was time for Mr. Abernathy's performance review. The annual meeting was Abernathy's coronation. He stood at a podium in the center of the clubhouse, backlit by a PowerPoint presentation displaying garish architectural renderings of his beloved marble gates. He spoke with the swagger of a man who believed his victory was total and absolute. He waxed poetic about his vision for a premier community, and then he dropped the bomb. To service the new loan and fund even more beautification, he was proposing another 15% increase in the quarterly dues. A wave of groans and angry murmurs rippled through the audience of my neighbors. One homeowner, a brave soul named Mr. Harrison, tried to stand an object. "Gerald, this is getting out of hand." Abernathy cut him off with a flick of his wrist. "We will have a period for questions and answers at the conclusion of the presentation, if time permits," he said, his voice dripping with dismissive authority. He clicked to the final slide, a summary of the new budget, and beamed at the room. "I now need a motion from the floor to approve the 2023 budget as presented." For a moment, there was only the stunned, resentful silence of the defeated. Then I rose slowly from my seat in the third row. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "Before we proceed to a vote, I believe there are some material facts regarding the financial underpinnings of this proposal that the homeowners deserve to hear." Abernathy's face clouded over. He let out an exasperated sigh, the kind a teacher reserves for a particularly slow student. "Mr. Pendleton, we've been over this. The finances are perfectly sound. Our trusted partners at Crestview Community Bank reviewed our application and approved the loan. They clearly have confidence in our vision." He smiled condescendingly, believing he had just checkmated me with my own line of questioning. I returned his smile with a calm, placid one of my own. "Yes, Mr. Abernathy, they did," I replied. "And as the new controlling shareholder of Crestview Bancorp and the recently appointed chairman of that bank's Credit and Risk Management Committee, I'm here tonight to discuss the very specific terms of that approval." The shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the clubhouse. Abernathy's smug expression dissolved, cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning, sickly panic. His face went pale. What did you just say?" he stammered, his voice suddenly small. I turned my attention from him and addressed the entire room, my voice clear and authoritative. "For the last 6 months, my holding company has been quietly acquiring a controlling interest in Crestview Community Bank, the sole financial institution that this HOA relies on for its very existence. The multi-million-dollar loan for this new gate, along with your primary operating line of credit and all of your cash reserves, are now under my direct oversight." Behind Abernathy, his gaudy PowerPoint presentation flickered. I walked to the front of the room, took the remote from his trembling hand, and clicked to a new slide I had prepared. Displayed on the screen for all to see was a scanned copy of the loan agreement he had so carelessly signed. With a laser pointer, I highlighted a specific paragraph. Mr. Abernathy was so excited about his loan approval that he perhaps neglected to read the covenants we insisted upon, I explained to the astonished crowd. Specifically, Covenant 74B, which requires the borrower, this HOA, to maintain a stable and sustainable financial model. This new budget, with its frivolous spending, its reliance on a third consecutive punitive fee hike, and its complete disregard for the financial well-being of the residents, places this association in direct and material violation of that covenant. I clicked the remote again. The words "technical default" appeared on the screen in large, red letters. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing. Abernathy was sputtering, his face a mask of impotent rage. "This is insane. It's illegal. You can't do this." "Oh, it's perfectly legal, Gerald," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. "It's just business. Now, as I see it, we have 2 options. Option A, I can make a phone call right now and instruct the bank's legal department to call the entire loan portfolio due, effective immediately. This would bankrupt the association, freeze all its assets, and likely result in a court-appointed receivership. Or, Option B, this entire board can tender its resignation, effective immediately. We can then hold a vote to nullify this ridiculous budget, elect an interim board to conduct a full, transparent audit of the last 5 years of spending, and restore the dues to their original, pre-increase level. The choice is yours, Mr. Abernathy. But I assure you, the bank's patience is wearing exceptionally thin." He looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face. He found none. All he saw were the stony, furious expressions of the neighbors he had bullied and belittled for years. His power, built on a foundation of petty rules and borrowed money, had just been foreclosed on. He slumped against the podium, utterly and completely broken. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the face of open revolt from the homeowners and financial ruin from the bank, Abernathy and his entire slate of board members resigned on the spot, a series of muttered, defeated pronouncements into the microphone. A motion was immediately put forward to elect an interim board. Mr. Harrison, the man Abernathy had shouted down, a retired civil engineer, was nominated. So was Sarah Jenkins, a sharp-as-a-tack CPA who lived 3 doors down from me. They were elected by unanimous, thunderous vote. Having made my point and reset the balance of power, I abstained. My work here was done. The subsequent audit, led by Sarah, was a revelation. It uncovered years of Abernathy's self-dealing. The preferred landscaping vendor getting all the contracts was, as I had suspected, a company owned by his brother-in-law, charging nearly double the market rate. The new security system he wanted was from a company that had given him a consulting fee. The interim board voided every crooked contract. They solicited competitive bids for all services. With the new efficiencies and the cancellation of the Marble Gate project, they found they could operate the community far more effectively. The new budget was presented 2 months later. Not only were the dues restored to their original level, they were actually lowered by an additional 10%. The community, once divided and resentful, was now united and engaged. People started talking to each other again, volunteering for committees, and taking genuine pride in their neighborhood. As for me, I never wanted to run an HOA, and I certainly never set out to own a bank. I eventually eased my holding company out of Crestview, selling my controlling stake at a healthy profit to a larger, responsible regional bank that was impressed with the efficiencies I had implemented. My goal was never profit or power. It was peace. It was justice. It was the simple desire to be left alone in my quiet home without being subject to the whims of a petty tyrant. When that peace was threatened, I realized the skills I'd spent a lifetime honing in the cutthroat world of finance could be a powerful tool for something more than just personal gain. The moral of this story is twofold. First, never, ever underestimate the quiet person in the back of the room. They might just be the one who understands the system better than you do. Second, true power rarely comes from shouting the loudest or making the most rules. True power lies in understanding the hidden architecture of the systems we live in, the financial flows, the legal structures, the unspoken dependencies. If you feel trapped by a system, don't just batter yourself against its walls. Look for its foundations. Find the source of its power. You might just discover that you have a lever big enough to move the world, or at the very least, your own little corner of it. What systems in your life could use a little strategic restructuring? You might be surprised by what you're capable of.